my friends. David Parsons here. Welcome to Nostalgia Trap. I hope you are doing well, as we are sitting here in late 2023 contemplating what seems like the inevitable return of the Trump Reich. Justin Rogers Cooper and I decided that we should sort of interrogate a little more something we started, I think, thinking about last year in more detail on this show, which is, the intersection of like masculine culture in the United States and like boy culture, and sort of unpacking all the kind of like broken boy daddy culture that Trump seems to signify, and how that mingles in with the left and the right. Trump's sort of foot soldiers are the Proud Boys, right? There's a lot going on there. Masculinity in crisis is a sort of an endless subject in American history. But there are certain dimensions to it that we've been wanting to get to lately, and I think today's episode is sort of a follow-up to last week's episode about Elliott Smith, in which we, I think, kind of got into Elliott Smith's childhood and his bad dad, and how that found its way into his art and into the way that people approach his art and why it resonated. There are a lot of people who can identify with the kind of bad dad circuitry. So we sort of want to get into that today, and we talk about this movie Stand By Me, which I'm sure you've probably heard of and maybe seen. It's one of the most popular films in American history. I think it's one of the biggest 80s films, certainly. But this was fun because I'm not, Stand By Me is a film that I've only seen recently, and Justin has sat with it his whole life, it sounds like. And I think there were a lot of dimensions to the conversation today that sort of link up with that Elliott Smith stuff. And what I want to sort of underline here before I play the conversation I had with Justin is that Justin kind of connects this stuff to the left, I think, in a really particular way. And that comes out later in this conversation. So it's been making me think a lot in terms of kind of how whatever we call the left intersects with this sort of circuitry that's broken between parents and children. And Stand By Me is a film that really takes that on in a very, very particular way. And the more I watch it, the more I understand why it's so popular. So this was a fun conversation. I hope you enjoy it. Go check out the Elliott Smith conversation from last week. That's on our Patreon page. I'll put the link in the episode description. You can sign up for our Patreon for free now for 7 days. So there's no reason not to go listen to that. And then if you remember, cancel the subscription within 7 days, or, as I would prefer, keep the subscription going and listen to the entire Nostalgia Trap library, because we've got a lot of stuff on there going back many years. So go check that out and enjoy this conversation on Stand By Me with my good friend Justin Rogers Cooper. All right, Justin, TGI Friday. How's it going? Good to see you.
Going pretty well. Looking forward to this conversation. And I want you to know that just like with the Calvin and Hobbes EP, I stopped Conrad in the kitchen this morning and was like, hey, what do you like about Stand By Me? And got some fun answers for you at some point.
Nice. So let's get into it. So we are continuing a little series here, I think, picking up a thread. If you want to go back to our last episode, actually, episode 374, Between the Bars, up on the Nostalgia Trap Patreon page, we talked about Elliott Smith and sort of connected it to a lot of the issues that you and I have touched on over the years, whether in private conversations or on this show, about, broken boys and a sort of broken boy culture that was present in the 80s and 90s when we were young men, and how that intersects with, larger political and social and even psychological stuff that you and I get into. But Elliott Smith certainly qualifies in that region. And one of the things that kind of surprised me or maybe didn't about our conversation about Elliott Smith, is how much, it touches on this relationship, this sort of formative relationship with a father, and like the boy, the father, and then like how that affects the artist in there. And so we decided to watch this film to kind of follow up, and I didn't even think of it really as a follow up, but it's one that I actually rhymes with a lot of that stuff. Is this 1986 movie called Stand By Me, which I think is a very well known film, actually, directed by Rob Reiner. It stars River Phoenix, Corey Feldman, Will Wheaton, Jerry O'Connell. And it's definitely, I mean, it's a prototypical, I mean, I think at this point, a timeless classic coming of age story. But it's got a lot of disturbing themes. And I think maybe one thing that we can start with, besides our own sort of like, I'd like to hear your own kind of like personal experience with this film. Is it one you've watched your whole life? Because it's one that I think I watched for the first time like 5 years ago, maybe. It's one I had to catch up on. But watching it last night, I realized it's rated R. And the fact that it's rated R sort of surprised me. I was like, oh, I always thought of this as kind of like a kid's movie or something, But then you watch it, and of course, I mean, it's based on a Stephen King story, and it's got a lot of gruesome themes. And I mean that not just in like a graphic corpse kind of way, because the story is about 4 boys going to see a dead body, but also in the gruesome, like psychological and social stuff that we get into in terms of talking about kids and parents and that kind of thing. So I guess we could start with Justin. I'd like to know kind of like, did you watch this film as a kid, or is this something you've caught up with later too?
Yeah, I saw it as a kid. I probably saw it when I was 9 or 10, 89, 90. I was at my friend's house, and I wasn't allowed to see rated R movies. And I'm not sure I knew this was rated R when we watched it, but he had a different set of rules. And so I could always see some stuff when I went over to his house that I wouldn't be able to see at my own. And this was definitely a movie that I would not have been able to see at my house, but I saw it at his, and I was just mesmerized by it, as a 9, 10-year-old. It was only a few years old at that point, as you just noted. And it meant a lot to me. I was a kid who was as sentimental then as I am now, which is a way to say I'll cry at everything now, but I was crying at everything then too. And so the themes of the movie really registered with me. And one of the things that I've always tracked in my own sentimental education, if you will, as I got older, was I was always hyper conscious of being young and how contingent that existence was and what the trade-offs were in terms of freedom and security. So I was a kid who would say things like, there's a character in the movie played by Corey Feldman, I think it's Teddy.
Yes.
And at one point they're all sloshing around, and one of the boys says to him, grow up, act your age. And he's like, I acted my age. I'm in the prime of my youth, and I'll never be this young again. I mean, that's what I thought about constantly as a kid and as a teenager. Like, I knew that I was afforded certain privileges, and that this period was very special. And the way the movie is framed as this nostalgic frame narrative, where you start with the old dad, my age, and
I realize he's like supposed to be like 45.
Yeah, and he's retrospecting back into the past. So it's like 80s going back into 1960. That move that was made there, I understood that. And the way that me and you always kind of talk about who we identify with in the movies, I could see myself in middle age looking back onto my life in the past and feeling similar kinds of feelings that he felt, if not specific to this particular story. And I knew then, I was like, oh my God, I'm living out the nostalgic memories that I'm going to have later. And this movie solidified that for me at a very young age. And there are a lot of elements I never let go, the scenes, the stories, the friendships. But that element, that structuring nostalgia while you're in the moment as it's being made, I never let that go.
That's funny, because Claudia has said that about you many times. She's like, Justin is nostalgic for moments as they are happening, right? Like you're already you're pre-nostalgic. It's like anticipatory nostalgia.
Yeah,
I get it. I mean, it's sort of a curse to think that way. I think it's part of the reason I titled this show Nostalgia Trap when I was first thinking about it, because it's like there's sort of this idea of like living in the past constantly, but also like doing that as you're as you're living and understanding, like, I think it's part of like trying to like resist nostalgia, is be like, I want to recognize the good old days while they're happening and not retroactively think, oh, those were the good old days. I want to, it's about time. It's about mortality. It's about sort of trying to keep a grasp on the narrative of your life as it's really slipping between your fingers. The sands of time kind of thing. I don't know.
Yeah.
The sentimental element, I recognize. I just want to say one thing. I've told a story before of like how I used to sit it down next to like a Smurfs record, and there was a particular song, like a lullaby at the end of the Smurfs record. This is when I'm like 5, 6, some of my earliest memories. And I would just weep and weep to the melody of this song and the sentiment of this song. And then my nephew, my brother's son, Josh, when he's like 4 or 5 years old, my mom says he sits next to the speaker and listens to Coldplay songs, and he holds his heart and he sways with his eyes closed, and like tears come to his eyes, and she's like, it reminds me of you. And I was like, oh, he's got the curse already, right?
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. And it's funny that I think, some people are obviously like that.
Yeah. And picking up on something else you said, which was the kind of age appropriateness of the movie and the rating, that captures in a nutshell some of the complexities of this nostalgic throwback, because this is actually not a so-called MAGA film, which is to say it's an easy Reagan-esque 80s movie where, by making America great again, that wish for the 1950s, that simplicity with its Jim Crow unconscious, that kind of white fantasy of Leave It to Beaver, the way we never were, to take the title of a book that me and you know quite well. What's interesting about this is the easy move to say, let's go back to that time period when things were better. That collapses very soon, and for some of the reasons why you mentioned. And yet these characters who are working through Good Will Hunting level of abuse, they're working through Elliott Smith level of abuse, they're working through and channeling some of these things we kind of, I guess today would call toxic masculinity, which is really, to me, one of the cruxes of the entire film. It's a staging, it's a historical staging of a clash of different modes of masculinity.
Yes.
And politics of masculinity. We might even say racialized masculinity, but I can table that for now. And
I think that's part of why people think often think that's like kind of a reactionary fantasy to go back to the 50s. The MAGA things like, oh, well, yeah, it was a great fantasy for white people. That's right. Sort of like, and it's like, yeah, I take that point. Part of me takes that point. I think Stephen King, as he gets older, definitely falls into this sort of like, I don't know, glossy nostalgia about the 50s. But at the same time, you're right. I mean, this story is not a story about how great things were during this era. In fact, it's sort of the timelessness is in its sort of the pathos of these boys, and how you can recognize that in 1995, 2023. I think the film survives in part because it's not stuck in the 60s, if that makes sense.
Right. Yeah. And, the demented road, that if you go far enough down into kind of a nightmare version of Mad Men, or kind of pick up on the brief Revolutionary Road book to film move there, that kind of rehearsal of the so-called like real bad patriarchy of that moment, to try to kind of untangle some of those complexities we just mentioned, I think comes up in an easy scene that otherwise might be, not important in the film, when the four boys, they're walking on the railroad tracks. And in one of many moments of the song, they're inhabiting pop culture, which is one of just a few minor keys that this movie and the book does really well, which is that it picks up on the role of pop culture in the formation of identity and the formation of young boys. And so they're singing lollipop, lollipop, ooh, ooh. And so you have this dark film about a group of guys struggling with abuse and neglect, struggling with bad dads. And they're walking to find the missing body of this kid named Ray Brower, who's been missing. It's like a missing 411 story. He's been missing. He's somewhere in the woods, and they get a tip from Vern's brother about where the body is. They set out on this kind of epic existential adventure, and on the way there, it toggles between boys who are amongst themselves trying to act as counselors, therapists, mentors, and like good dads to each other, as they're also trying to like have a pretense of an innocent childhood. Lollipop, lollipop. And so after that scene, the contrast hits, because in some ways they're they're tangling with what it means to be an adult in a world, and especially in the movie and the book, where almost all the adults are corrupt or fucked up. Almost all of them. It's a world where the children are the only ones who have a kind of ability to try to navigate change, because the adults have already been fixed in a certain way, and they're also actually hardcore antagonists. After that scene of Lollipop, in one of a couple scenes where they refer to this, they have brought a pack of cigarettes with them, which we see as this kind of adult drug, a kind of minor drug, but a drug nonetheless. And they keep saying, cigarette tastes best after supper. I think River Phoenix has that line because he snagged these cigarettes from his dad, the same dad who beats him relentlessly, as even if you read the book, sends him to the hospital. So he's haunted in a certain way because he's enacting some of the same behavioral patterns of the person who's like fighting him and repressing him and holding him back and not giving him the nourishment that he needs to grow as a human. So that, to me, that scene encapsulates the whole, like, is it an R movie about kids in one kind of way?
Yeah, totally. And I mean, the journey that they're taking is so brilliant, because it's the coming of age is boiled down to something so simple, which is them walking towards a dead body, right? And what they're walking towards is becoming adults. They're walking towards wisdom and self-realization and the end of childhood, the end of innocence, and all of those themes could be laid out in really trite ways in another film, I think. But in this movie, they sort of take their time and sort of the kids, like they're on that edge of being for a child and adult, and that's a weird time. And I think the movie captures the weirdness of that moment in time really well. A lot of the sort of corporeal obsessions of the vomit and the sort of leeches and the genitals, and just like, it's a real, like, this is a 12-year-old boy, and I think 12-year-old girls too. I think that I've talked about, like, this film was introduced to me by Claudia, who loves this film, and she said she's loved it since it came out in the 80s, and in part because of the sort of, to her, timelessness, and I think even cross-gender identification of what childhood is like and what that moment of self-awareness is like. But either way, that kind of like getting to the dead body, to me, that's like they're walking towards and they kind of subconsciously know they're walking towards the end of childhood, and that's why they're thinking about what they're going to be when they're older, and there's a sense of tragedy to, like, growing up. There's a sense of tragedy because they have a kind of fatalistic attitude about it. And maybe I can just say that the main plot line, and then we can talk about the other characters. But Gordy, the guy played by Will Wheaton, he's a writer, and his older brother Denny, played by John Cusack, in some really great flashbacks that I think are so just economically done, just from a filmmaking perspective. They just sort of like give you flashes of like, oh, I understand why this older brother was such a special figure to him. But he loses his older brother. His older brother dies in a car accident, and his parents don't really get over it. And his dad is sort of clearly disappointed that, like, the good son, the football player, the one that exhibited what I think you would call a normative masculinity, is the one that died. And the little, like, queer writer kid, the one that writes weird stories, is the one that survives. And so there's a level of, like, survivor's guilt that he's feeling through his father in this movie. And that's sort of like, in a lot of ways, I think the core story that spins off into all the other characters and their relationships with their parents, which is so heartbreaking part of this movie. At the end of this movie, I was, like, kind of recalling how both nostalgic and fun this movie is to watch, and also, like, really heavy. It's a sad movie.
It's a really sad movie. And, for lack of a better word, in the midst of all the storylines you just described, there's also a storyline that's about there's a love story, for lack of a better phrase, between Chris Chambers and Gordy. Chris and Gordy, played by River Phoenix and Will Wheaton, they have a really beautiful, special friendship, and the connection they have is both similar to the Affleck Damon connection in Good Will Hunting for the first third of that film, and it's similar to the Matt Damon Robin Williams relationship, because it's a healing relationship that's in part based on touching and crying. Of course, not sexualized touching, but lots of gimme skin,
I
lots
was
of hugs,
thinking that one of
arms
the
around the shoulder.
final, like how that one of the final sort of moments of their time together is give me some skin, and I was sort of,
Yeah,
I thought about that. And I was like, there's a reason why that's in the script, there's a reason why that is highlighted there. And that the film, is about bodies, like literally dead bodies and otherwise.
and it asks us to think about, because like Good Will Hunting, it's a film about how are men supposed to relate to one another, and how do you, especially in a community that's like essentially founded on homosexual panic, how do you navigate the line between queer and straight, and how is that actually constructed and sustained? How do you become intimate with someone while still asserting the fact that you're straight? Like those cultural codes are important to the film. So part of the film is also about, if you're presenting alternative modes of masculinity and alternative modes of like male relation, what are the limits to that, and what is the liminal space of that? And Give Me Some Skin is sort of in there. And I just want to quickly mark out, we can come back to it, one of the most haunting scenes occurs at the end in this kind of love story, because when Chris and Gordy separate after their epic adventure, and Chris asks for some skin, and Gordy says, "I'll see you around," and he says, "Not if I see you first." That look in River Phoenix's eye, that look is he's a beautiful actor and person, but that look is love. And I think that male friendship, that foundation of love between friends, is a deep part of why the film also has that staying power in the way that you and Claudia might describe, because it is something that you can identify with past the historical era, or even past gender, because what you're really looking at is, this is the last line of the film, friendship. Right. I never had the friends like I did when I was 12. Jesus, does anyone? That's what it's about. What do you do with the people in your life that you like deeply love, that you don't get to live with because it doesn't conform to like the normative patterns of household formation? You know what I mean? Like,
dude,
I might love you. We can't like live together. You know what I mean? Because in some ways we're separated by all kinds of things, but there is a loss, not just a death loss with Chris later, but there's a loss to the fact that the people you consider your fam aren't people you're allowed to like live around. You know what I mean?
Yeah. You lose them. And there's this film is sort of about them all knowing that. You know what I mean? Knowing that they're going to lose them. Yeah, I mean, you sent me a piece with a couple different interviews with Rob Reiner and Kiefer Sutherland and other figures from the film. And Kiefer Sutherland, he says like, "Oh, that summer," and then he's like, "Now I realize that I was in that film, and then Lost Boys, and then Young Guns," and he's like, "That was like the time of my life." Like, and he says, "Nothing I've done since has ever matched that." And I mean, that's part of what the nostalgia trap is to me, always like resisting this sort of feeling. But the other part of me is like, no, that's real. And I'm going to talk to an author who's written a book. He's a psychologist. It's next week. So stay tuned for this episode in a few weeks, I guess. But he has an argument that nostalgia has like a positive purpose in people's lives. And I'm really interested in talking with him about sort of like the other side of nostalgia as a sort of, I don't know, a feature of survival, and a feature of sort of giving meaning to people's lives and that sort of thing. And it makes sense. I mean,
that's awesome.
You and me are both, I think you more than me, but you see the room behind me here, like collecting like historical ephemera. And it's weird because a lot of it looks like stuff from my father's age, like the 40s, the 50s, the 60s. These are the sort of things I want to grab onto more so than like, I don't know, stuff from the 90s necessarily, although I'll certainly grab stuff from that era too. I don't know. There's a sort of there's a link to the past through those physical objects that I think both of us participate in, right?
Well, let me bring one link of my own nostalgic collection into the story here, because you I think really eloquently described how they're walking towards something. I also want to just pause on the kind of not just the mythological symbolism of the train tracks and the train, but the actual historical significance of that for a minute, being like a train guy, And I think what's interesting is the train is the 19th century technology that's still plowing through the landscape. And if you go back to like the Leo Marx machine in the garden argument, Hawthorne and all those like 19th century transcendentalists and quasi-utopianists and literary stars of the 19th century, they looked upon the train as a corrupting technology that was deflowering, beautiful nature. All that was itself, colonial myth that they had inherited. But the point that I'm making is
wait for the Federal Highway Act.
the train was a kind of monstrous technology, and even as late as the late 19th century, when you get Frank Norris's The Octopus and all this kind of stuff, the railroad tracks themselves and the corporations behind them were envisioned to be an octopus, strangling the country with its power and capital. And so even though the train in the 1960s is actually a different train altogether, it's a train that has long passed its economic and political primacy in the country. It has already given way to the automobile. The fact that in 1960 in this film, you don't have that many cars yet. It's still a train town is significant because the little town they're in, this working class town of Castle Rock, ends up being a kind of leftover town from the 19th century. It was obviously a train stop for textile mills because remember the original story was set in Maine. The movie is set in Oregon, but the function of the town was like a natural resource town, whether you look at Maine or Oregon. So the economic function of this town was the same. And in the same way that we look at deindustrialization now through like the lens of the Rust Belt, these little towns in the 1960s were themselves the deindustrialized, de-railroaded towns of the early 20th and late 19th century. So you're looking at a group of boys who are coming up in like a cultural and economic wasteland that's already past its prime. In the same way that, Bruce Springsteen sings about the songs in the Midwest of the guys who have no longer got the factory job. And I think that's really important because when you look at those dads, they're like all alcoholics, but even when you look at Teddy's dad, they're veterans and they're taking out the effects of World War II. Famously, my dad fought at Normandy, like Teddy's dad has PTSD, takes it out on Teddy, and he's institutionalized, upstate. And
their dads are like living wreckage of the 20th century. And like that scene where the guy that owns the junkyard has this interaction between the fence with the boys where he's telling them like basically get the fuck out of my junkyard or I'll stick my dog on you. And Teddy calls him like a fatso or something. And the guy just hits back and is like, your dad, I know who you are. Your dad is a loony. He lost his fucking mind after the war. And you know what? This is a part of the movie that I really I wanted to ask you about because you mentioned the adults being shitty in the movie. They are. And he's that's a startling scene when the junkyard dude like gives him no social grace whatsoever as a child and just like lays into him and says really like hurtful, personal, fucked up shit about him about like your dad is fucking crazy and you're all fucking failures. And I know all of you are just going to grow up to be fucking losers. And you're like, dude, the fact that adults are that bitter like is so scary. Like an adult, and I encountered adults like this when I was a kid. I don't know if you did, but I encountered adults that are like, they've lost the ability to like be nice to a kid even, right? They're like ready to fucking be really shitty. And to me, like that's part of growing up is like realizing that adults aren't always on your side. And like some kids grow up faster than others because they meet those adults very young in their life. Often it's their parent, right? That like doesn't give them the grace of being a kid and treats them like an adult and says shitty things. God, that junkyard scene really got to me because I was like, there's a fucking dude that doesn't give a fuck with their kids. He wants to hurt their feelings and fuck with them. And he will because he's a bitter asshole. And that's like, I don't know. It's a bitter lesson that they have to learn.
Yeah, and it's not for nothing that it's in a junkyard, that all their fathers are working class, that this town is economically frayed. Because then when you start to put the kind of toxic patriarchy, that culture together with what's happening, you start to see that there are economic modes of toxic patriarchy. So it's not like only the working class guys are actually toxic in life. That's not true. In fact, it's probably the opposite. But the point that I'm making here is Stephen King, and to an extent Rob Reiner, are making a proposition that people who lack resources, and also people that have been through world war,
Right.
don't come out chipper and fucking sprightly and good dads by instinct. They don't come out like that on the other side. Remember too, Normandy, that's fucking Steven Spielberg, good Matt Damon territory there. What's Saving Private Ryan? That's supposed to be the fucking good war, the good sacrifice. The dad who stormed the beaches at Normandy and survived is one of the biggest assholes in this world.
Yeah, and it's also like, how could it be a MAGA film when this would be allegedly this was a time when we all respected the troops and we all respected what they had done in World War II. This guy like treats World War II like it's Vietnam. He's like, fuck your Vietnam, fuck your World War II. Your dad fucking came back and lost his fucking mind because he's a big fucking loser. And you're like, dude, this is like a very bleak vision of sort of an American social reality in 1960. And you're right. It almost functions as counterpoint music to hear all this lollipop shit in the background of like literally like candy world of pop culture that I think is often given to us as the vision of especially the late 50s and early 60s, when it's like, oh, these kids are sad kids and they're going through wrenching experiences, and the adults are not all clean cut, happy, leave it to beaver adults. They're like pissed off about everything that's happened to them.
None of them are the men in the gray flannel suit that you're supposed to associate with like the middle class suburban bourgeois GI Bill fucking 1950s.
Right,
it's
exactly.
Really, in many ways, it's a late 50s film because it's 1960 at best. I'm going to read you a quick passage from The Body at the junkyard scene, because one of the sentences in there actually made me think of you. And I also want to just bring up The Body too, because I don't know if we'll have total time to talk about all the differences, but I just want to make a proposition here. If I flip back and forth just to the novel once or twice here in our discussion, the proposition is Rob Reiner made a lot of strategic decisions about how to remodel the script that was based on this book. And characters that say certain lines in the book are said by other characters in the movie. And to take another example of this, in the book, at the end climax scene where Ace confronts them to try to take ownership of the body, Will Wheaton's character, the narrator in the text, is the one that says, "Suck my fat one, you cheap dime store hood," but he doesn't have the gun. Chris Chambers has the gun. River Phoenix had the gun.
Interesting.
So Reiner made a number of decisions like that throughout, and I have to say, the choices Reiner made not only made the book tighter in terms of its narrative flow, but he changed some of the agency in the story, and he rewired some of the sentimental functions of certain scenes, and in making those consolidations. And I hate to say it like this, in making it more sentimental, he made it way more effective. And so the thing we call Stand By Me isn't really it's based on Stephen King's The Body. But if you said to me, Justin, who's the author of this particular narrative, I would say it's King Reiner. The choices are so stark that the question of authorship is just an interesting one. I just want to throw that out there.
And it's one that comes up a lot with Stephen King. The sort of Kubrick Shining thing is very famous in terms of, and the development of Stephen King's written work into cinema and TV shows, I think for whatever reason is a site of a lot of people talk, in part because I think King himself has been very vocal about how satisfied or unsatisfied he's been with some of these adaptations.
Yeah. And it's worth noting then that King, when he was shown a private screening of this, said it was the most successful adaptation of any of his work up to that point.
I could see that.
And excused himself for 15 minutes after the end of the film.
the tone to me of having read a lot of Stephen King, it captures really well the tone of so much of his work, which is this sort of, I don't know, really warm nostalgia for a period that was really fucked up. This film is a lot like It as well.
Boy,
It's like
that's
a
well
very
said.
similar story, right? It's like It is a bunch of kids experience walking around this broken town experiencing horror. It's a clown instead of a dead body, but he's interested in that. That sort of like I mean, what better way to explore it than through like that 12-year-old that's like sort of almost aware of all the fucked up things in life and kind of is, but is on the edge. I think King is brilliant in part, is probably one of the most popular cultural producers in human history because he's tapped into that combination of like sweet nostalgia and darkness that is like, I don't know, the engine of so much interest, I guess. I don't know.
I'll sign on to that. Also, that's really well said. The sweet nostalgia and the darkness there. What kind
The
of darkness
nostalgia
was it?
trap. That's
Yeah, yeah. So we'll listen to this nostalgia trap. This is the junkyard scene. We can just move right on. But I think you'll recognize this as what you just said. So Teddy and Vern and the boys are looking for a water pump at the junkyard. That's why they're there, to kind of chill out and hydrate. And he starts and he says, it was maybe 80 feet deep. This is like the pit where the pump is. It was maybe 80 feet deep and filled with all the American things that get empty, wear out, or just don't work anymore. There was so much stuff that my eyes hurt just looking at it. Or maybe it was your brain that actually hurt because it could never quite decide what your eye should stop on. Then your eye would stop or be stopped by something that seemed as out of place as those limp clock faces or the living room in the desert. That's a Dali reference. A brass bedstead leaning drunkenly in the sun. A little girl's dolly looking amazedly between her thighs as she gave birth to stuffing. An overturned Studebaker automobile with its chrome bullet nose glittering in the sun like some Buck Rogers missile. One of those giant water bottles they have in office buildings, transformed by the summer sun into a hot, blazing sapphire. I mean, that's just to me an extraordinary passage of prose
oh
and the
shit. Yeah.
hallucinatory, almost psychedelic rendering of the junk as these discarded consumer objects that are personified and take on somewhat ghastly, even kind of Cobain-esque dimensions in terms of his paintings and the doll. Those qualities of the junkyard and of the narrator's mind, I think, are symptomatic of the kind of consciousness,
Yeah.
in addition to the
Yes.
tone you just said, but the consciousness that you've reminded us inhabits a 12-year-old boy.
Yeah, and King taps into that really well. I mean, he's someone who it's funny because that book on writing of his is a book that he talks about the practice of writing, because people are always asking him, how do you fucking produce so much stuff, and it's also really good. Like a lot of it is really great. And he obviously has a lot of tips about sort of how he sits down, in the morning at the desk and gets all his distractions out of the way and writes for 4 hours. He says he's able to write about 30 pages a day. Which is intense level of production, especially of that stuff. But the other part of me is like, dude, the reality is, in the other interviews from his like early years, especially in the 70s, when he was writing all this stuff, including The Body, he's like, I was doing so much coke and pills and smoking weed and drinking. Like I was just wasted in front of the typewriter. And I don't remember writing a lot of that stuff. Like I have no memory of it. In other words, it was, you mentioned psychedelic. Or hallucinatory. I mean, in a lot of ways, this guy is. I think of Stephen King as a hyper observant guy of American life and culture of a certain period in time, who's able to shove a ton of drugs into his brain and get into this trance and really just download this shit. And that's what, to me, like, there's a really compelling piece you just read. Like that sounds like it's poetry in a lot of ways. But it's also kind of like, I don't know, channeled. I'm very interested in that sort of like it's channeled from some of these artists are able to tap into some stream, dude, and like whatever what they're able to connect whatever they're seeing in their mind to like their fingers running across the typewriter. And to me, there's some really, I don't know, there's some really compelling shit you can find in there, in part from like a an author that's sort of checked himself out of the equation in some ways. I think in some ways Stephen King's writing gets worse when he sobers up and starts really trying too hard, if that makes sense.
Let's think. Yeah, I think that's all super well said. And, let's try one more little authorial note before diving back into the film, maybe. And just off what you just said, when Reiner and King account for their feelings about this film, this is how they put it. When Reiner explains that he made Gordy the central focus of the movie, and then he says, at that point, the movie was all about a kid who didn't feel good about himself and whose father didn't love him. And through the experience of going to find the dead body and his friendship with these boys, he began to feel empowered and went on to become a very successful writer. He basically became Stephen King. So just factor that in. And then here's what happened with the King moment that I was describing to you earlier, when King excuses himself to compose himself. He's that emotionally affected, and he comes back out of this private screening, comes out of, I guess, the other room, comes back to the group, and he says, that's the best film I've ever made. That's the best film ever made of anything I've written, which isn't saying much, but you really captured my story. It's autobiographical. And so then you're kind of thinking like, well, it's not just a period piece. It continues to be about fathers in the same way that Good Will Hunting is. And I want to just jump to one of, I think the key, one of the key, not the only key, but one of the key traps. And it reminded me a lot of George Carlin's ideas about the military, father army, that like shaped him up and like gave him in some ways a disciplinary and professional boost early in his life. And he was like, I don't support war, but the military made me who I am. In a similar kind of trappy function, both Chris and Teddy really bring out what happens to boys whose dads abuse them, what happens to boys who were beaten by their fathers. And that still happens today. But in another sense, I kind of tend to think that mode of intimate, violent patriarchy in terms of children was symptomatic of that generation, and possibly for many generations of American men, in a way that today, intimate partner violence is the leading cause of mass shootings in the United States in 2023. Fathers still take out toxic traits on their toxic expressions on their family. The violent patriarchy is still there. It registers frequently with a gun. The gun is frequently turned on the dad, but it's mostly frequently turned on women, and it's mostly frequently turned on domestic partners and marriage spouses.
If you want to do this,
I just wanted to note that.
I mean, it's making me think. I mean, generationally, the like we're talking about boomers, right? We're talking about a generation of kids who were born to parents of that went through the Great Depression and World War II. And the thing that the boomers have told us again and again in all of this culture, in which boomers became like sort of big cultural producers, obviously, and wanted to tell this story of the 1960s. They wanted to tell the story of their childhood again and again and again. And we've heard like Forrest Gump and everything else tell this story of what happened during this era. But one of the things that comes out of all of these films is they want to tell us like their parents were fucked up, and like fucked up like. And I get that from my own parents. My parents are boomers, and my parents' parents were Great Depression, World War II generation. I didn't meet any of them really. I met my grandmother, who died in 2010, but everyone else was basically dead by the time I was a child. They died when they were like 60 years old. And the stories my parents tell of them vary, but the basic gist of it is that they were like silent people, or they were angry people, or they were like fucking tough and like put a lot of a burden on their kids one way or the other. And the dads especially, I mean, I grew up with stories of bad dads from the 1940s and 1950s, and it seems like a trope that is very present in this movie. There's some, there's always abusive parents and there's always shitty dads. That's like timeless. But there's also like what the particular generational experience that we've sort of gone through in the 20th century America has a certain brand of bad dad, if that makes sense. And I'm thinking about like the Wonder Years, the dad on the Wonder Years, the kind of like brutal asshole that like doesn't want to talk about anything and like has like retrograde kind of attitudes. That's just a archetype of boomer produced pop culture. It's sort of like we've been living in the pathos of their their bad parentage for a long time.
Yeah, although if you follow that dad in the arc of the show and the dad in A Christmas Story, what you come to see is even though they're both kind of like clinically aloof, they're both sentimentally recovered.
Mm.
And in some ways, those characters are inhabiting the very space you articulate in order to bring that dad back into the imagined family in a way that recuperates that generation
Yes.
for their children to soften the fucking blow of the things that actually happened, if that
But
makes
isn't
sense.
that a fantasy? I mean, and like a psychologically necessary fantasy is of like healing the childhood. I mean, it's very clear at the sort of like apex of this film when they finally reach the dead body, and the two central characters here, Will Wheaton and River Phoenix, have this sort of like moment with the dead body because it's obvious that he's sitting there. The Will Wheaton character, Gordy, is having like a sort of breakdown. He's traumatized by the dead body in part because he's thinking about his older brother being dead. And he's saying, you know, my dad hates me. He hates me. He hates me. I'm no good. And what does River Phoenix say as the counselor, as the older, wiser kid? He says he doesn't hate you. He just doesn't know you, right? And he sort of, it's the wisdom of the River Phoenix character is to know that you have to have a better story about your dad, whether it's true or not, in order to move on. It makes me think of this. This is a random thing, but I remember hearing, like, reading all these like stories about like people getting healed through like psychedelic shamanism, right? And I remember the story of this woman who had trauma from her father, doing like an ayahuasca ceremony, in which she's taken this intense psychedelic brew in the jungle somewhere, and she's narrating this later, and she says she saw her father figure as a hallucination during this ceremony rising out of her chest as a like a black cockroach that was sitting there like hissing at her. She could visibly see the trauma of her bad relationship with her father rising out of her chest as this cockroach. And she said through a series of like rituals and singing and working with the shaman, they turned this hallucination slowly from the cockroach into this flower. And then through breathing, she breathed this beautiful flower back into her heart, and it disappeared into her heart and melted back into her. And so it, to me, it feels like that visualization, that suturing, however it happens, it seems like we know we have to create a better story for ourselves about what happened to us if we want to move forward. I don't know. That's the healing moment for today, Justin. Sorry.
Well, it's interesting because it makes me think of a few things. That scene you describe, which is in many ways the emotional climax of the interior frame narrative, like the kind of nostalgic climax of the frame narrative is the Richard Dreyfuss character at the end remembering Chris Chambers, and the kind of, you realize the movie does this really well, that when Chris is lost, you feel that loss because you've come to know Chris through River Phoenix, and he's just so charismatic that you feel a tenderness for him, like he could be your little brother or your older brother depending on how old you are. And when Richard Dreyfuss loses someone of that magnitude, you can really feel it. I mean, we've all lost people, and I feel like I've lost people of that magnitude. And so
it's strange also that River Phoenix actually died, and so the film functions in a double way at the end when he's mourning his loss, and mourning his loss of like, oh, he was gone too soon type of thing. It's like it's functioning in both ways. And to me, that last look that you mentioned where River Phoenix says, not if I see you first, I was sort of, I swear, watching it last night, there was like, I was electrically like startled by that moment because of how much his eyes flash up. I just saw in that literal 1 second glance what everyone always says about River Phoenix, which is like, this guy was like really special, and you can really feel it in that moment. There was something, it's endlessly tragic that he died the way he did and the age he did.
Yeah, it's that moment is one of many of the exceptional and singular moments of his performance in this film. It's also probably not but a reason why this film has just tremendous lasting legacy.
Mm-hmm.
In that scene, what's interesting is that Will Wheaton, Gordy, is crying to Chris, and he's crying over his dad, not the dad that beat him, the dad that doesn't love him, and how much you need a father's love. And he's crying to Chris, and the tears that he sheds is one of the key ways that straight men and boys share intimacy, and they're very akin to the tears that were shed between Sean and Will when he says it's not your fault.
Mm-hmm.
Don't fuck with me, Sean. It's not your fault, son. Like that.
Yeah.
Those tears and the hug there. It's both about healing, but it's delimiting the regulation of intimacy among men that like can't fuck. You know, and I'm not trying to like say anything about Chris and Gordy there too much.
No, I get it.
But I'm saying that like that whole movie and the whole book is that homosexual panic of being like, I'm not a pussy, you know, am I? But that tear scene, I just want to call back, is paralleled to when Chris is crying to Gordy around the campfire when they talk about the stolen milk money, and he's saying, I come from a bad family. No one expects anything from me. I just want to go to a town where no one knows me. And in that scene, Chris is crying to Gordy. And then prior to that, after that scene at the junkyard, when the guy insults Teddy's dad, the veteran from Normandy, Teddy has a complete spill out. And when you cycle the way through the film, it's only Vern that never has the intimate moment, the complete breakdown.
He's the most innocent of all of them and the furthest from adulthood, I think, in that film. Yeah.
But the three boys who weep to the other boys or boy are interesting moments because I think they track the kind of therapeutic intimacy that we're describing as constitutive of how boys or men can love one another within certain cultural moments or in certain relationships, but also because it's a point that's so obvious, but I think it's worth stating because I think it suggests a kind of theory for other things. But the point that's so obvious is the person who harms you isn't the one you shed tears in front of. I think that's really, really, really important, that the abuse that you take in one time in one space with one man, you don't release it there. You release it with other people in other spaces in other times, and it's a displacement effect. That the trauma that you encounter, not only is it not healed at the point of its attack, but the trauma can only be expressed later through these tears to people you trust or that you're reaching out to, that you're hoping with. And I just think that the reason I express that so much is because what we're theorizing then, as we were theorizing with the Elliott Smith, is the actual ways that alienation produces social relations, the actual ways that alienation, like in an economically deprived town, in an economically depressed area, in a town where the men are discarded like the objects in that junkyard, where the people's bodies and lives are as wasted as the things that King was describing, when those people produce kids that they're traumatizing all over again, the relationships that are expressed happen and necessitate an intimacy that we associate with Elliott Smith songs and that we associate with Good Will Hunting. But the expression or the necessity of that intimacy contains a set of scenes writ large and discourses that are not the standard discursive elements of left political thought, just to go back to our last episode. And that is one of the reasons why
I'm like, wait, I was like, well, where's this going? Like,
that is one of the reasons why this nostalgia trap.
What do you mean by that? Like, yeah.
That's the why we're talking about this trap on a show that's about left culture and politics.
Yeah.
You know, I just wanted to make sure that was driven home. Same as last time.
I mean, this is something that I've tried to get at a lot with trying to come to terms with my experiences in junior high. I mean, I live only a few blocks. I just walked past that campus right before we recorded this podcast, and it's a site of trauma, really. And why is that? In part because it's the school that was on at the time. The way the district worked, I was sort of shipped to a school. I was bused to a school that was in a socially depressed area. So I went to school with all the kind of like kids from the other side of the railroad tracks. Totally the Stand By Me kids, like 100%. And it's even the same time period. I mean, it's 1986. I mean, it's like, you know, Corey Feldman and all that sort of type of kid. They're like, I don't know, a lot of like ratty, like mullet headed white kids that were sort of like tough, you know, and you could tell they were tough. Like I felt very pampered coming to them in part because I just had parents that weren't divorced and weren't alcoholics. And that seemed like the kind of normative experience. And these were angry fucking kids. These are like, you and I have told many stories about like dealing with bullies. But so much of my memory now of like the being bullied by these kids in middle school is sort of recognizing the rage of their experiences being sort of directed at me. And that's sort of that, you talk about the left and like what that means, sort of how the sort of, I don't know, the shrapnel, the collateral damage of capital fucking with people comes down through the kids fucking with each other at school. And then we're thinking about mass shootings happening in schools. There's starting to be some connective tissue, in other words, between like violence and rage, economic deprivation, drug abuse, alcoholism. The family part of this is really key. And what you've said about like the end of this movie, does anybody ever have any friends like they had when they were 12? Well, I don't know. I wasn't close to a lot of kids when I was 12. I didn't have this I don't have this group of comrades like these kids did. Although, I did have best friends, and I did have, I think close enough analog to what the idea of what you're talking about, which is that there's nothing more pure than the two kids that are like, or three kids or whatever, that are like doing something in the woods together or playing together in some way. And then how 13 and 14 and 15 comes and you go in different directions in some way. I don't know. There's a dark cloud. It's weird. Parents anticipate it, right? Like parents anticipate that like, well, my kid's 11 now, my kid's 12 now, something's going to happen, right? Like some change is happening. I mean, we're talking about puberty essentially, in the biological respect, but really it's like, I don't know, something happens to kids at that age. And it's one that this film taps into really, really well.
I think from, what I would say is the reason I bring it up and why all the things you just narrated are so important and probably very recognizable to people is because the straw man left that I often invoke is just like the class oriented, working class oriented white male tanky. That's who I always have in my mind. The people who thought fucking Medicare for all was going to be the cure for all ills. And again, it's a straw man target, but I'm hoping that if I shoot off a shotgun, some of the pellets land. And the reason I have that straw man in my head is because the classical Marx, Communist Manifesto Marx that articulates the revolution in terms of class consciousness isn't the primary mode in which alienated consciousnesses experience their alienation. So as an example, the way that people experience capitalism in this film is through abusive dads. And what they want to talk about is their abusive dads. That's what they want to talk about. The language of fathers. That's the discourse that activates them. That's what they want. They want to confess. They want to cry. They want to
even
hug.
If it's true that they said, if only my dad had a better job and we had more money and we had access to healthcare, I would have had a better relationship with my father. Even if that's true, which I think maybe it is. I think that, you could heal some social problems with pouring money on the problem. But the other part of it is like, that's not how people narrate it. I think that's really important. Like what you're saying is that people want to talk about the bad dad. They don't want to talk about the socioeconomic relations that produce the bad dad.
Well, yeah. And also the kind of economic relief script isn't emotionally activating unless you understand the context. So in other words, there's a lot of people from all classes on the left that can hear those scripts and make the connection that like, oh, I clearly understand how my childhood trauma was an expression of socioeconomic deprivation. But if you haven't had that education, if you haven't gone to college or read those books and ever had been introduced to that connective tissue, as you say, then it sounds kind of out of left field because the thing you're trying to work through is family damage, but the scripts that they're shouting at you from the podium aren't about your family. And so that is one side of this complicating narrative that in some ways it's
stuff that's too easy. It's the stuff that we were talking about the other day of like racism. Well, we just need more education. And you're kind of like, well, what the fuck? Why is that? That seems like a kind of like cliche of an answer and one that we should probably interrogate as just like the simple solution to these things. And I understand we're going after straw men here because to me, like I don't know. Typically, I tend to identify with a lot of these sort of attitudes. But the other part of me is
Sure.
like, yeah, story is what exists in people's lives, and the stories of the way they relate to their friends and family and lovers and all that sort of stuff seems to be like, I don't know. You're right. Like that's the sort of like place where you can move around the larger issues, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And, I with my eye on the clock, a couple final points. One, the other side of this is Teddy, who in a key moment, the narrator, this is in the book too, after Teddy's been ranked by the junkyard owner and it has his breakdown, the narrator says, I wondered how Teddy could care so much for his dad who practically killed him. Nostalgia trap, George
Wow.
Carlin, the
Yep.
whole fucking thing comes through. In other words, part of what our response is to abuse is a kind of Stockholm syndrome slash, the intimacy that's created through violence isn't always the thing that will expel you from the relationship. It often is. It often isn't. So when we look to figures today that are essentially abusive dads, and why the political figure of the abusive dad is so fucking powerful, that the center of gravity that's created around this person is both love and hate in the culture. So there's a love-hate relationship to these abusive dads, because
But if there's love and hate, makes it even more powerful. Like the love and hate of the daddy figure, you've got lightning in a bottle, and that's Donald Trump. I mean, it's sort of like the fact that liberals hate Donald Trump so fucking much is a key part of the reason why others love him so much, and the combined effect of that love and hate is it means he's like an uber figure of of like American political and cultural life in some way, because he's that bad daddy you hate to love. I mean, you love to hate, etc. I mean, it's in other words, it's like really powerful storytelling elements there within the characters. It's George Lucas shit. It's Joseph Campbell shit.
Yeah, it is. And my final point would just maybe on a note of hope. That's also, again, it's almost like
today's note of hope brought to you by Burger King.
Yeah, I would call it like a feminist contrast to my tanky straw man shotgun image. And that's when Chris and Gordy are talking, and Chris is encouraging Gordy and saying, you are a real writer. And at one point he says to Gordy, who's kind of talking back, he said, you're just a kid, Gordy. And this idea that the Chris character is like way older than he actually is in the book and the movie. And that's one reason why River Phoenix nailed the role, is that he appears way older than he is, actually enacting out this very strange singularity. And he says, you're just a kid, Gordy. And Gordy's like, fuck you, kind of a thing. And he's like, I wish the hell I was your dad. And then he says to Gordy, kids lose everything unless there's someone there to look out for them. And key fucking line, that's the it's not your fault type line.
Yes.
It brings the two boys together. And I just want to make one note. Unlike Good Will Hunting, where Matt Damon goes to get the girl and Ben Affleck stays at the construction site, we never, Ben Affleck walks off the porch and he's like, I love that shrug at the end where he goes back to the car and he's like, he's not here. And Damon grants Affleck's wish to like see him gone. Okay, in this story though, which is so interesting, Gordy and Chris make it out together, and Chris goes to law school. And even though he later has like a tragic ending in the fast food restaurant, and that's a whole nother thing, him and Gordy, they build each other up. And even though Chris says, I wish I was your dad, and he has that kind of paternal quality, even as a 12-year-old, that allows Gordy to feel safe and trusted and gives Gordy a sense of confidence in himself that he desperately needs. Gordy also gives it back to Chris. And in the book, it happens in a different place. But at the end of the movie, when he's like, am I ever going to get out of here? And Gordy says to him, you can do anything you want, man. That's such a beautiful reciprocation. Mm-hmm. And they both get out together. And what's hopeful, brought to you from Burger King, but what's hopeful to me about that moment is that two guys who are intimate and close who cry together, who protect each other, who trust each other, they manage to manage all those years of abuse, and they manage their way out. And that's not just a story about boys, that's also a story about girls and women. It's about how many people have fucking fought back off of that bad person. They fought back and they went on.
Yeah. I mean, that was our revelation last week, Justin, was a sort of like, this is like a kind of Me Too for boys in some way. And you're right. Will and Sean in Good Will Hunting, they're different ages, but they need each other to move on. Like, they need each other. Sean needs Will as much as Will needs Sean. Sean is just, there's a reason why Sean goes home and drinks in that movie when he sort of meets Will, because he knows that he has to do the same thing the boys in Stand By Me have to do, which is something that seems very, very hard, but you have to take a journey, and you're going to need comrades in order to overcome and become, an adult. And by becoming an adult, I mean not the adult that's the junkyard guy that's fucking filled with bitterness, or the dad. I think that's part of the nightmare, is like, you're going to become that dad. Like, Chris Chambers' character, River Phoenix, is like, I don't want to become any of this. Like, I want to shed this identity. And I think that, I don't know, that's a very common reaction. But yeah, thank you for watching this film with me, Justin. Stand By Me is one that, fits in really, really well with this theme. And I'm thinking now, if others are listening, what other movies can we think of that hit this specific theme of, like, I don't know, it's not just boyhood, it's like coming of age, along with a sort of healing of a broken childhood. Obviously, it's a theme. It's a common one, but it's done in a very specific way. And the last thing I want to say about Stand By Me is, I'm just really impressed by how it didn't fall into that sticky, lame form of nostalgia that we sometimes associate with, I don't know, Forrest Gump type movies, even though I'm still a Forrest Gump fan in many ways. But that kind of, like, I don't know, that cliche of this era. This film sort of, I don't know, I just felt like I was in that time period. And I think it, in a lot of ways, the film is a rare success in blending the nostalgia for the era with a kind of social realism, that this film ends up being like fucking Bicycle Thief or something, Italian neo-realist, a vision of social life in America at a certain time that, it's funny because the reviews at the time, many critics were like, oh, this is sugary nostalgia for the 60s or something. But as time goes on and the film becomes like a timeless classic that new generations sort of discover, I think we realize what I'd realized watching it last night, which is that the film is not really just about the 60s. It's about all the stuff we talked about in this episode. That's sort of I don't know, the recovery of trauma. And it's really, to me, soaking in its time with Great Depression and World War II stuff, but also I don't know. I saw those boys in the 90s and 2000s, and I think I continued to see them. So thank you, Justin.
Thank you. Right on.
Well, all right, my friends, I think that's going to do it for today's Nostalgia Trap. I want to thank Justin Rogers Cooper, as always, for going down the nostalgia memory hole with me. Stand By Me is a film that I think is kind of an ultimate nostalgia film, but I wonder what films and TV shows and other pieces of art we might be missing. What are your ultimate Nostalgia Trap movies? Let us know. Go check out the Nostalgia Trap Patreon page. We appreciate your support. Hope you're doing well. Let's keep on trucking, man. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.